and welcome to Let's Talk About Health. I'm Dr. Madeline Mant, and today we are joined by Dr. Travis Chi Wing Lau, who's going to discuss his work as an assistant professor of English. So welcome, Travis. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity to chat.
Absolutely. So Travis, you're an assistant professor of English. And so what does that job entail, and how does it relate to health?
So this is an interesting question. I tell people this all the time that in a fantasy land about 10 years ago, I wanted to be a bio major, and I was really interested in thinking about the ways in which we understand life as we might describe it. And I realized that for my life, I could not do science and math. And I always had an investment in literature, as we might think about it, capital L literature. But I'm really now interested in thinking about the relationship between literature and what we think of as medicine and science. And my job is to think about these scientific texts, scientific treatises as texts. And that's how I try to describe what it is I do as somebody who does health humanities and disability studies, alongside sort of teaching the core things that we might think of as literary studies, close reading, making arguments with evidence. In many ways, I think what has been really great about thinking across disciplinary lines is what kinds of evidence can we marshal to answer a question like what is health or what is illness in a historical moment? And I work in the 18th and 19th centuries, so those terms are already very vexed and transforming rapidly in those 2 centuries.
That's fascinating. So you talk a little bit about you wanted to start out in bio, but how did you get from maybe wanting to do biology into being here? What was your path, and what kind of skills did you gather as you were going along that educational journey?
So I think I realized very early on that I was maybe frustrated is the wrong word, but I'm comfortable with the ways in which science framed itself as always in some ways obvious knowledge that is unchallengeable. Right, the idea that scientific authority is in and of itself an inherent to scientific thinking. And I kept wondering, how do we respond to that? What are the ways in which we might think of science as actually a series of constructed arguments or actually relying on things that are literary, right? The forms of metaphor or the forms of sort of figurative language that is necessary for us to explain a kind of concept. The one I tend to talk to students about is they think about the ATP chain or glycolysis in these terms that are in many ways literary, right? So I try to explain to students that, well, much of science actually relies on language. And what do we do with that, right? And to sort of think about how I got to this point, I was really interested in sort of tracing those connections between literature and science in a historical moment. I've always been interested in the body, particularly representations of the body. I was really interested in Gothic novels during my undergraduate career. And I found myself asking the same question over again. Why do bodies get represented a certain way? And how do these literary bodies reflect the ways in which science and medicine were understanding bodies at the exact same time?
Yeah.
So the question of what constitutes a body and what do bodies look like and operate like became a very politicized and loaded question. And I think that's sort of shaped a lot of how I think about literature and science now, especially vis-a-vis disability studies.
Right. So I'm getting a little sense there. I'm really excited to talk more about language. Obviously, you're a professor of English. Language is your bread and butter. And so how are you using and understanding words like health and illness and wellness and sickness in your work?
So I think for me, I was really influenced by the work of Georges Canguilhem, who was really interested in this distinction between the normal and the pathological. So I'm really interested in the ways in which health gets designated as a sort of normal state of being, that healthiness is the state of being that should be desired and that we should always be moving toward. Anything else is considered pathological. And while that can be seemingly neutral, and my students tend to say like, well, what's the problem with that? What's wrong with saying healthy and ill? As we sort of put pressure on those terms, they often get attached to certain cultural assumptions about, say, immorality, weakness, incapability, or in some cases, if we want to take it to some of its extremes, the justification for genocide and eugenics. And I think that cultural and social influence on what seems like apolitical science is what is particularly interesting to me,
Yeah.
and perhaps what makes my work, in my mind, politically valuable, because we're seeing the ways in which a term gets mobilized toward other aims other than designating a state of being.
Right. Now, you're talking about, I'm hearing things like politics coming up here, and that's really, really interesting too, and the social and cultural sort of constructions and reframing of certain words. And so could you speak a little bit towards use of terms like disability studies or crip studies when we're talking about normality or anormality of certain bodies?
Sure. So disability, the way I like to talk about this is that in terms of all the identity categories that I came into consciousness trying to figure out,
Mhm.
disability was the last one because I think it's the one in which I encountered last in terms of my experience trying to understand issues of the body. Disability is a politicized identity category, especially in the US, right?
Mhm.
In the wake of 80s and 90s disability activism, there was a desire to reclaim disability as an identity category like we would describe queer, right? Queer was a
Okay.
slur, and with the move in politics to reclaim queerness, disability was also sort of reclaimed. And so when people ask, so how do you identify? I identify as a disabled man. That does not necessarily have the kind of negative valence that many people might expect, right? To
Right.
identify as disabled, there was a lot of controversy between whether or not people preferred people first language or our identity first language. So are you a person with disabilities or a disabled person? And depending on who you ask, it can be very different. But I think for the most part, the communities that I revolve in, there's been a real desire to claim disability as an identity. I am disabled. And since then, I think the movement toward empowerment and reclamation has given way to what has been described as crip or crip studies.
Yeah.
And I think the way I like to describe it is, again, in terms of how LGBTQ studies versus queer studies is trying to distinguish itself, where queerness is a more activist, politicized identity category that is invested in dismantling what we might think of as heteronormativity, if we want to put it in queer terms,
Mhm.
and for crip studies, dismantling what we might think of as able-bodiedness, compulsory able-bodiedness. That able-bodiedness is the norm and therefore the only valuable identity and embodiment.
Yeah.
So it's more, if we might want to think about it more, it's defining itself very much against this structure of able-bodiedness.
Now, everything you've said is incredibly fascinating. And so I know that everybody who watches this video will go, I'm changing my major and I would like to get right into English disability studies. I know I'm like, I should redo my PhD, man. This is fascinating. So if you have somebody who is feeling those feelings of wanting to really get into disability or to crip studies or just to look more at health humanities, what advice would you give somebody who might have those interests?
Sure. So I think one of the best things about where we are right now is that interdisciplinarity is a really valuable thing.
Mhm.
And I tell students, many of whom are in STEM or pre-professional tracks, that there are ways to do this that still allow you to enter into the field, into the clinic if you want, but
Mhm.
still be able to do this kind of exploratory work. As much as I know that it can be extremely demanding, I know I've had many students do MD PhDs to be able to sort of do this kind of joint work and pursue interdisciplinary degrees in which there are either concentrations or side or other sort of minors or even like degree programs that are focused in health humanities and narrative medicine. The first one I think of is at Columbia, which has a narrative medicine program, right? So I think a lot of the anxiety that, say, students have about who, like, I want to go to med school, is that they're somehow going to be separate from
Right.
the work of, say, disability studies or health humanities, but these are both very interdisciplinary fields, and they're not dominated by people only in English or history, but in fact, there now is an increasing contingent of clinicians, nurses, and health professionals that
Mhm.
are doing this all the time. So,
No, that's great. And I love hearing about interdisciplinarity. That's something that I really work towards my own research program and really try to encourage students that there's a lot of strength in drawing from different sources of knowledge and ensuring that things don't become siloed or remain siloed. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Travis, for sharing your expertise today. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And I want to also thank our audience for tuning in. So thank you for your time today, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk About Health.
Thanks so much.